Okay, so last week we spoke about the resolution of the Aguna cases that arose in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, and we spoke about how in many cases, I actually looked at my records, there were 18 cases in all that we became familiar with, approximately 10 or 11 that were brought to our attention to resolve, and 6 or 7 other cases that we consulted with other batid and other rabbinical courts and rabbinical authorities that they worked on resolving that involved husbands who had been working or were in the vicinity of 9/11 at the time that the World Trade Center towers were attacked, and they were presumed to be dead, but their remains were not definitively or completely found, and in many or most cases their remains were not found or identified at all, and therefore there became a need for the Beit, for the rabbinical court, to identify the husbands from the perspective of Jewish law as having died, so that the wives would be permitted to remarry, and otherwise the wives would have been agunot. They would have been prohibited, according to Jewish law, from being able to remarry. And we pointed out that this was analogous to the situations mentioned in the Talmud, for example, of a man who sinks on a ship into an ocean, and his remains are never found, even though there may have been witnesses who saw that the man was on a sinking ship. Nonetheless, since the ocean is very vast, if it's a mayim she'ein lahem sof, a boundless body of water where the witnesses wouldn't have been able to see the boundaries of the water, then there's always a slight chance that maybe the man survived and that nobody knows, and maybe he's living in some desert island somewhere or on another continent, and therefore the wife is prohibited from remarrying until there is more definitive evidence. And that, of course, is contrasted from the case of mayim she'esh lahem sof, where you have witnesses, or even one witness, who witnesses that a man falls into a bounded body of water, like a small lake, and doesn't emerge from that water after a period of time in which the man definitely would have died. But we say that when the evidence is such that there is a certainty that the man died, even though nobody actually saw the man die, or there's a near certainty, what we would call like a calculus the limit approaching 100% of a certainty, that a man had died based on a certain situation, then the rabbinical court would grant permission for the wife to remarry, so she would not be an aguna. And many of the cases that were dealt with throughout the centuries in rabbinic literature involve situations such as this, where a man had drowned at sea, and the question was whether the evidence was good enough to prove beyond the shadow of reasonable rabbinic doubt that a man was dead, so that the wife would be permitted to remarry. And this also extended to other types of cases. We spoke about the case that the Talmud speaks about of the fiery furnace. A person goes into a fiery furnace. Is there a chance that maybe a miracle occurred and they were saved from the fiery furnace? So we say if it was certainly a steep fiery furnace that nobody could reasonably have emerged from, then the assumption is that the man died, and the wife would be permitted to remarry. And then we spoke about harder cases. Let's say that a man was walking towards the direction of a bridge, and there was a bomb that caused the bridge to collapse, but nobody actually even saw that the man made it to the bridge. So there's rabbinic literature about whether we say that since the strong probability is that the man was walking in that direction, he would have been on the bridge at the time that the bridge collapsed. Therefore, we would assume that the man must have died, even though his remains were never found. And these were some of the types of rabbinic law precedents that had to be relied upon in the investigative work that was done, particularly by the Beit I was involved with, the Beit of America in New York City, in resolving the different 9/11 Aguna cases. And we spoke about the difference between the men who were located on the upper floors of the North Tower and the men who were located on the South Tower. They were both attacked within approximately 16 minutes after each other. The North Tower was hit around 8:46 in the morning on September 11th. The plane cut across the area of the 92nd or 93rd floor of the North Tower and pretty much severed the upper part of the building from the lower part of the building. So it was a certainty that if a man was working and was known to be located in one of the offices above the 92nd floor, he had no way of escaping from a certain death. Either he would be engulfed in the flames or he would fall 100 floors to certain death. So that was akin to the case of a man being seen as going into a fiery furnace, where we know that nobody could escape alive absent a miracle, and we don't worry about a miracle having occurred unless we know for sure that a miracle occurred. So the wife would be allowed to remarry on that basis. And the South Tower cases, which were a little trickier, because the South Tower, which was hit at approximately 9:02 and 9:03 in the morning by a plane that cut in a zigzag fashion into the area around the 78th floor of the building, did not get hit in such a way that all areas of passage were cut off. There was still one rickety staircase that remained passable and viable even after the plane hit the building. So even if it was known that a man was in his office on this in the South Tower, even if the person was known to have been in an area above the 78th floor at the time that the South Tower was hit, there was still a remote possibility that the man would have been able to get down the one staircase that remained passable. We know of approximately 12 cases of men or women, who were able to go down that one staircase from the upper floors even after the South Tower was hit. So for men who worked in the South Tower, there was a need for additional evidence. And in most of the cases, we had additional evidence, such as one case where there was a pair of pants, and there were body parts found in that pair of pants. Whoever occupied that pair of pants clearly died, and in that pair of pants, which matched the victim identification profile of the particular man who was missing, were also found the wallet with many different pieces of the man's identification, as well as his keys and sunglasses. So there were multiple forms of identification that were able to supplement the knowledge that the man was in the building at the time that the building was hit. And we were able to rely upon that combination of circumstantial evidence in order to permit the wives to remarry. But all of this that we've discussed up until now centers around the primary or classical Halakhic question of aguna, of can the wife of a missing man be permitted to remarry when the body has not been fully identified, and on what basis can a rabbinical court make its finding that there is enough evidence of a death, whether based on certain types of physical evidence, or whether based on circumstantial evidence and testimony of a person's location and circumstances and whereabouts, in order for the wife not to be stuck for the rest of her life and to be able to move on with her life and remarry. So that was the analysis. But what was also something of a surprise to us is that we were confronted with a host of other ancillary Halakhic issues as well, meaning that in the course of helping the families come to terms with their tragic and catastrophic loss in what was a completely horrific situation, and providing a framework for being able to deal with this tragedy from the perspective of Jewish law, we discovered that other Jewish law issues arose as well. And I'd like to do tonight, for this part of the presentation, for this part of the series, is to discuss some of the other Halakhic issues that were presented to the Beit, and other Halakhic issues that just presented themselves in the course of dealing with this tragedy. So if you look, the first category, I'm going to discuss three categories, or we'll discuss at least two, and maybe we'll get to the third, is the first category is the mourning and burial issues. Meaning that one question that presented itself was that it would probably be a long process for the Beit to collect all the evidence, all the data, and interview co-workers, interview people who spoke to the individuals on the telephone that day, and gather evidence, and even inspect evidence from the New York City Medical Examiner's Office if there had been a positive identification based on DNA identification or something like that. So it was clear that this process was probably going to go on for months, and indeed, it did go on for several months until we were able to resolve the various cases. So that was going to be a prolonged process, and yet the families were grieving. The families knew that based on the circumstances, there was certainly, if not a definitive finding of death from the outset, there was certainly a probability of death, akin to the case of a man who falls into the boundless waters, a man who falls from his ship into an ocean, like think of the case of the Titanic. And the fact there was a rabbinic response to him about permitting a wife of one of the men who was on the Titanic to remarry by an American rabbinic authority, Rabbi Yaakov Meskin. He wrote a long tshuva, a long response to him about it as to what the grounds would be to permit the woman to remarry. So it's interesting, I don't know how many of you ever saw the movie The Titanic, but I guess he hadn't, because his assumption was, he was just writing a year or two after the tragedy, but he said that normally we don't permit a woman to remarry on the basis of the husband falling into an ocean or a boundless body of water, because maybe he emerged somewhere else. But here, the people didn't fall into the water fell into the ship, and all of the people were trapped on the ship itself. Either they were able to get out on rafts or whatever, but otherwise, he said, the vast majority of people were actually trapped in the ship, where the ship was overwhelmed with the water and they were stuck on the boat itself. So he said in such a case, that would be more akin to falling into a bounded body of water where it was known that somebody was trapped on the ship. There's no way that they could have possibly survived. And I guess that there was some testimony from a survivor, at least in his case, that the man who was missing was in that type of a predicament, so therefore he was able to distinguish. But in that type of case, you know that even if the man fell into the water, and there's this remote possibility that maybe he emerged somewhere else, like the Talmudic tales that tell about such cases, you know that the probability is that the person is dead. And the family has a desire to engage in a grieving process, the avelus, the mourning. So do they have to delay the mourning process until the Beit Din has done all of its work and collected all of its evidence? This could be very, very challenging to a family. While they might be entertaining some sort of hope that a miracle would have occurred, or some very unusual circumstance would have occurred, that the man the person actually survived, but they're already settling into the mindset that this is most probably not the case. So would the families of the 9/11 victims who came to us, would mourning be permitted or not? Would they be allowed to sit Shiva? So this was one case, this was one question that immediately presented itself to us, even before we were able to resolve any of the cases. So if you look in source one, the Shulchan Aruch talks about somebody who drowns or is seen as having sunk into water that is bounded, so that we know that the person had definitely died. We just haven't recovered their body. So when do you start counting the Shiva? The point in time in which the authorities, or at least the family, has given up hope that they will ever be able to recover the body. And then the halacha goes on to say that in the event, the matsuei varim evarim, if they found parts of the body, still the mourning does not begin until they have found the majority of the person's body, or they have given up hope. Given up hope of what? Given up hope of being able to find the majority of the person's body. Let's say that they still entertain the hope, like this was the case in the aftermath of the World Trade Center, that there was a search immediately after the towers toppled to the ground. There were some bodies that were immediately recovered in the 2, 3, 4 days afterwards, where the vast majority of the person's body was able to be recovered. But as time went on, and all that they really had was small bone samples and pieces of tissue and flesh, which were really tiny, tiny parts of a person's overall physical composition. Certainly at a certain point in time, even if there was a hope of recovering a tiny speck of a person's body, there was not really a hope of being able to recover the totality. of a person's body after a certain point in time. So we're told that at the point in time in which a family gives up hope of recovering the majority of the body of the person who is missing, whom they know has died, so that's when Avelus kicks in. That's when the mourning process would kick in. So the Shach, commentator to the Shulchan Aruch, as we know, was compiled in the 16th century. The Shach, who lived in the 17th century, was one of the most authoritative commentators on the Shulchan Aruch. Always kind of, gives me a sense of perspective or maybe urgency in terms of my own rabbinic career and work, because the Shach was one of the most prolific writers and scholars when it came to Jewish law, and he's still one of the foremost authorities who are relied upon by distinguished rabbis with long, white beards to this very day. But the Shach died when he was 41 years old. So it just gives you a sense that you can't fool around too much when you're younger. You really have to get to work. So it just always kind of has that sobering effect on me. Whenever I'm slouching off, I think to myself, what about the Shach? Think of what he accomplished by the time he was 41. Wow. So anyway, so the Shach says that the reason why the Shulchan Aruch talks about Mayim Sheyesh Lahem Sof, a person who falls into the boundless body of water like an ocean, is because La Fuke She'en Lahem Sof. Says that if it would be a type of case where it's boundless like an ocean and there isn't a definitive determination of death yet, a misablin ulav. Klal says then there's no avelus, then there's no mourning at all, because he says that he quotes from an earlier authority, very early authority, the Rif, who says that if a person drowns in waters or is seen as falling into waters that are boundless, ein hetel ishto lo yino gavelus, and if there has not been permission given to the wife to remarry, so there can't be any observance of mourning. So I just gave you, I didn't translate into English these particular passages, but what I did translate was from the book Yesodei Smachos, which is an English compendium of the laws of mourning. What are the best English compendiums of laws of mourning? Now there's a very, very long one, very heavy hardcover volume. I guess it comes in soft cover as well, called The Laws of Mourning, which is very, very good, put out, I think, by Art School. But before there was that, in the 1970s, there was this book put out by Rabbi Aaron Felder from Philadelphia. He just passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 70. But an excellent book, much, much shorter, more concise work. They're both excellent books, but his was really, still, I think, very, very useful. It's not sold in the stores, but it's good to get a hold of as for somebody who wants to review the laws. So he just summarizes, basically, the discussion of the Shulchan Aruch and the Shach as follows. It says, when there is a presumption of death of a male spouse, Shiva is observed if one has been declared dead by a rabbinical court within 30 days after attempts to recover the body have ceased. Since mourning would only begin after there is a despair over never being able to recover the body, so the general rule in mourning is that once that moment in time kicks in when one would mourn, and one then mourns within 30 days, so then there would be Shiva. But if one waited more than 30 days after that moment in time, so then there would not be a full Shiva, there would only be 1 day of mourning. So let's say that the authorities or the family had given up hope of ever recovering the full body, and then the Beis Din issues its determination that the person can be declared dead as a matter of Jewish law 35 days after that point in time. So what Rabbi Felder is saying is that then the 30-day period, what we call Shmua Krova, is it within a short period of time that's called Shmua Krova, or is it within a longer period of time, more than 30 days, that's called Shmua Rechoka, then it's already considered to be Shmua Rechoka. It's a longer period of time, and then there wouldn't be the full days of a Shiva anymore. But he says that this is only the case if you're dealing with an aguna situation where it would be contradictory to have the woman sitting Shiva on the one hand, but yet, on the other hand, not yet permitted to remarry because of the chance that maybe the husband is still alive. So that's like a contradiction of sorts. On the one hand, we're worried the husband's still alive, on the other hand, she's sitting Shiva. But he says that we're not dealing with that type of a contradiction. If such a case concerned any other relative, where there's a probability of death, so then one may sit Shiva upon termination of the search, end of a story. Now, question is, there were a couple of questions that arose over here. One is whether there's any room for leniency, because we had certain cases, one case in particular that was brought to our attention, where for therapeutic purposes, the wife, presumed widow, really wanted to sit Shiva right away. It was extremely distressing for her to be in this limbo state where she couldn't even have the finality of people coming and comforting her and sitting and going through the Shiva process, while at the same time she knew that her case had been submitted to the Beit for a resolution. While there were other families for whom the whole experience was just so horrid and so horrific, in a way they were relieved to be spared from the specter of having to sit and talk about everything that happened and go through the entire Shiva process. So the question was whether there would be the possibility of giving different guidance to different families based on their therapeutic needs. So there is a general principle when it comes to mourning that's, source base over here. This is articulated many times in the Gemara. The statement of Shmuel, Halakhic divrei hamekel ba'avel, that whenever it comes to matters of mourning, we always follow the lenient authority. What does it mean we follow the lenient authority? If there's a question whether to observe a velus or not observe a velus, or whether to end the velus a little earlier, end it a little bit later, so we always follow the lenient opinion when it comes to matters of mourning. That's a special rule when it comes to matters of mourning. In part it has to do with the fact that most of the laws of mourning are only rabbinic in nature, but it's also, we even go beyond normal rules of leniency that might apply to other rabbinic laws when it comes to matters of mourning. So if you look at this longer passage here, which is the third passage, what we call Gimel, this is the collection of tshuvos, of responsa that was put together by an authority known as the Piskei Tshuva. It appears in the bottom of the page in the Shulchan Aruch. The Piskei Tshuva was a rabbi in Poland, Rabbi Avam Tzvi Hirsch Eisenstadt. He lived a little longer than the Shach, 55 years. Okay, so Rabbi Eisenstadt was an incredible figure in terms of collecting all of the major responsa literature that had been published post the Shulchan Aruch, meaning after the 16th century, until his day. And he not only put it all together, but he even gave comments as to which authorities he thought made more sense, which made less sense, and he often would give you a bottom line resolution of his own. So he was not only a person who was good at collecting data, but he was also very good at processing the data. And Rabbi Eisenstadt quotes a number of authorities that say that maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room over here. So he quotes an authority known as the Knesset Yechezkel, who says that in the event that it's kfar meforsam, this is like the second line of source Gimel, kfar meforsam sheshochin shayil setchuas l'rabanim, it's already well publicized that the woman's plight, the woman who is in the predicament of potentially being an aguna, when it's known that her plight has already been submitted to distinguished rabbis, a distinguished rabbinical court for resolution, so nobody is going to come to the mistaken conclusion or deduction that because she is observing certain aspects of mourning, that means that she's permitted to remarry, because people know that it's all in the hands of the rabbinical court to decide whether or not she's permitted to remarry. So then he says that maybe there's some more room for leniency. And he also quotes another authority, Rav Yaakov Breisher, the Shavus Yaakov, who says that we can distinguish between the wife on the one hand and other relatives on the other hand. That's what Rabbi Felder was saying, that even if we suspend her mourning, if maybe at least the other relatives should be allowed to mourn, because we don't have to worry that it's going to be result in a mistake, that they're going to be permitted to remarry, since they're permitted to remarry anyway. It's not a question of their husband being lost at sea. Let's say it's a single man. Let's say a single unmarried man falls into an ocean, and we are pretty sure he's dead, but we're not 100% sure. So then mourning would be permitted, says the Shus Yaakov, in such a case, since we're pretty sure that he's dead. And the Piskei Tshuva goes on to quote other authorities, saying that certainly when you have some circumstantial, the last authority he quotes, the Mishkanos Yaakov, he says that certainly when you have certain circumstantial evidence that a person probably died, even if the Beis Din hasn't come to its final conclusion that the wife is permitted to remarry, he says he thinks that mourning can be bifurcated from the determination that the woman is free to remarry, and maybe mourning can be permitted under those circumstances. And there's also another responsum from the Kesav Sofer, Rabbi Abraham Sofer, who lived in the 19th century. He was the son of the famous luminary, the Chasam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, where he also writes in one of his responsa that he thinks that the two issues can potentially be bifurcated, particularly based on the rationale that we're not worried that if we permit a woman to mourn or instruct her to mourn based on the probability of her husband's death, that she's going to take that as a license, or other people will take this as a license, that she can start dating and she can get remarried, since everybody knows that the matter has been submitted to a rabbinical court and everybody is waiting for the resolution of the rabbinical court. So this one woman in question, she had suffered a miscarriage earlier in the marriage, and the couple didn't have any children at that point in time. Now she was pregnant. She actually discovered she was pregnant like right around the time of 9/11. It's not entirely clear to me whether, I think that her husband knew that she was pregnant. She was like maybe 45 days into her pregnancy, something like that, at the time of 9/11. And the family was very, very afraid that because of the trauma of the tragedy, and also her inability to be able to have the therapeutic process of mourning, that she was more likely to miscarry again as a result. And they asked if special dispensation could be given to allow mourning in this case. And our feeling was that based on these various responsa, based on the Knesset Yechezkel, based on the Mishkanos Yaakov, based on the Kesav Sofer that I mentioned, that all say that if the matter has been submitted to a rabbinical court, so that the woman knows that she's not going to be able to remarry until the rabbinical court issues its determination, then mourning can be permitted under those circumstances. And this was an unusual application of the principle of Halakhic K'divrei Hamekel Ba'avel, that the law is always like the lenient attitude when it comes to mourning, because normally the way that we would apply that principle is that the law is normally like the authority who says, you don't have to mourn. It's okay, you can put it off. But in this case, the leniency dictated that we should allow her to mourn because that's what she needed therapeutically. So we came to the conclusion in our Bezdin that the principle of following the lenient opinion sometimes dictated that you follow the lenient opinion to allow somebody to mourn. So therefore we instructed the rabbi of her community that it would be legitimate to rely upon those authorities. And I wrote this up. I'll just, I know it's, I'm not sure that it's good form to quote from oneself, but it's from a book. We put a book together on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 called Contending with Catastrophe, which was a collection of the responsa, many of them translated into English in the aftermath of 9/11. Together with a number of philosophical essays by various Jewish thinkers such as the late Rabbi Lichtenstein and Yibadul Chaim Rabbi Norman Lamb and others, Dr. David Schatz, just philosophically exploring the ramifications of a tragedy of this tremendous magnitude. And I wrote an essay about my own personal experiences working as the director of the Beit at the time and putting together all the information in a log and gathering up all of the data regarding 9/11. So I wrote a little bit about these cases. So this is, if you take a look in source number 4, I spoke about the Riverdale case. That was, the woman was from Riverdale, Riverdale, New York, in the Bronx. It was imperative that the widow be spared any unnecessary stress and be allowed to begin the healing process as soon as possible. It was recognized that the Beit process could take several months in terms of responsibly gathering evidence and compiling final decisions from universally respected Jewish law authorities. Accordingly, the Beit of America advised her rabbi that he was permitted to rely upon those opinions that allow mourning to commence as soon as the case has been submitted to the Beit of America for ultimate resolution. In similar fashion, we provided guidance to Rabbi Meir Rabibo of the rabbinate in Paris. One of the victims was a man who had originally come from Paris, and he was working in New York in the World Trade Center. His family was still in Paris, his parents were in Paris, and they wanted to know when to begin the mourning process with respect to when mourning should begin for the French parents of another one of the World Trade Center victims. Now, their request came in the beginning of March, and the question was, had this 30-day period from when everybody had despaired of the possibility of recovering bodies had that 30-day period already expired. Because if that 30-day period had already expired, so then the family wouldn't be able to observe a full Shiva period. And they took a little while, it was already the beginning of March, but the parents felt that it was important to them that they also wanted to have a full week of Shiva. So the question was whether we could say that they're still within the 30 days. So if you look at source the fifth source, which is from the dossier, I guess, of the Beit of America, where we recorded all of the documentary information and all of the data that we had compiled. So we recorded the following conversation. On February 28, 2002, Mr. Sam Benson of the Emergency Management Division of the New York City Police Department stated, conversation with Rabbi Willig, one of our Dayanim, the assistant head Bezdin of the Beit of America, that there were only 2 areas that had not been excavated. One area was near the North Tower, but would most likely not contain remains of anyone other than those on the lower level of the North Tower. The other area was a larger structure near the South Tower that has not been searched due to its precarious position. Therefore, the person in question, their son, was somebody who was missing but had worked in the North Tower. Therefore, it was not expected that further remains will be found of those on the upper stories of the North Tower, meaning that the official declaration that was given to us at the Beit of America that even if a particular family had given up hope of recovering the remains of someone who had been missing at an earlier point in time, but let's say in this particular case the family still held up hope for a longer period of time, was it reasonable to still hold on to hope of recovering remains? So the date in which we were officially told that there was not really a reasonable chance of recovering significant remains from anyone from the North Tower was February 28th. And it was the beginning of March that we were asked to resolve this question with the family from Paris. So we wrote to Rabbi Rabbi, the family's rabbi in Paris, that since it was still within the 30 days of when we were given this information that they had given up hope, that's the standard of the Shulchan Aruch, Nisyayish giving up hope of recovering the bodies, that they would be allowed to observe the full week of Shiva at that point in time. Yes?
Is the Yeush, the despair of finding remains, or despair that the person may still be alive?
This is despair of finding remains. Now, the Paris case was different from the Riverdale case, because in the Riverdale case, we were also relying on these authorities that said that, look, even in a case where there's still a possibility that the person is alive, if there's a probability that the person is dead, then mourning can begin, together with a giving up of finding the remains of the body, even though the Beit has not yet completely resolved the case. In the Paris case, the family wanted to wait until the Beit made its resolution. The Beit made its resolution around the end of February, based on the data that they had collected that the person had definitely died, and then they wanted to start observing the mourning from when the Beit made its resolution. But the standard for observing the Shiva is not based upon when the Beit makes its determination. It's based on when there is despair from ever finding the remains. So we had to find that there was still some possibility up until that moment in time of finding the remains. So that's why we turned to the emergency management workers to tell us, and they said, yeah, this is around the time that we're giving up hope. So on that basis, they were able to sit Shiva. Now there was, just to give an example, there was one other family that consulted with us that, as I mentioned earlier, for them it would have been very, very difficult. It would have been so heartbreaking for them. It was parents of a man who had died, and it was too much trauma for them to sit Shiva, and therefore for them it was easier to just wait until the Beit made its determination, and to say, well, the Beit is making its determination that the son died at a period which was more than 30 days after there had been a giving up of hope of finding substantial remains of the son, and therefore they didn't end up sitting Shiva. But then what happened was that there was a piece of the son's body that was ultimately identified through DNA identification. So then the question was that piece was released to the family. Was it appropriate to have any sort of mourning at that moment in time? So if you turn, sources 6 and 7 just deal with the question of when do you start counting the 30 days. That if you want to be lenient and not observe a mourning, so there is one opinion that says that you don't start counting the 30 days when at the point in time in which there is despair over finding the body. So Rabbi Shab Saikon, the Shach says that's when you start counting the 30 days. But the Stei Chemed, who's the Stei Chemed? That's Chaim Cheskia Medini, another 19th century authority who compiled lots of responsa literature. He lived a little bit after the Piskei Tshuva, so it's a more up-to-date compilation of responsa literature. It's always the question, I don't know how many of you have pondered this question, it's interesting to me. I assume anything interesting to me is interesting to everybody. So I ponder the question, we speak about different eras, different periods of time in rabbinic literature. We speak about the early rabbinic authorities as the Rishonim and later rabbinic authorities as the Achronim. And some say that we can't really assume that we're still living in the age of the Achronim. That at a certain point in time, there was a new Tekufa, there was a new period, a new era. And maybe that new era began somewhere in the late 19th century, early 20th century of heads of yeshivot, like Rosh Yeshiva. Maybe now we're in the new era of Rosh Yeshiva. So if you're going to say that the era of Achronim came to an end, how do you define at that point of demarcation? So I've always made the observation, anybody who's quoted by the Piskei Tshuva, who lived until 1868, is definitely an Achron. Like, if they made it into the Piskei Tshuva, they're an Achron. It could be, if you want to go a little further out, it's possible that anyone who's quoted by the Stei Chemed is also an Achron. That's possible. Maybe that would be sort of the outer limit if you're going to draw a demarcation line. So the Stei Chemed quotes opinions that say that at the point in time in which it's appropriate to observe mourning because the family has despaired from ever finding substantial remains of the body, you don't count the 30 days from that moment in time. You then count, is it 30 days from when the person would have died? And if it's 30 days, let's say the moment of despair happened on December 11th, but the person would have died on September 11th. So he says even if the family is ready to start mourning on December 11th itself, he says since it's 60 days after September 11th, there still wouldn't be any mourning. So therefore, for a family who wanted to avoid the mourning, so there were also grounds to rely upon. That's why I quoted this as well. So if you look at source 9, page 3, so this talks about what happens if you find somebody. If somebody is, source 8, on the very bottom of page 2, going over to page 3, Hamalakin at Somas Aviv. If somebody collects some of the bones of a family member, he speaks specifically about a father, but it could be all Shar Krovim, it could be other family members as well, Misa'aber Ram Kol Yom Kulo. Then there is a velus, there is mourning that takes place on that day. So therefore, for this family that avoided the mourning, but then when did they have the closure in which they felt that they were prepared to, observe some type of a ritual mourning? So that was in the day in which they were given this DNA sample, this DNA identified piece of the body. I think it was a shoulder bone, something like that, when they were given that to bury. So the halacha is that at the point in time, even if somebody is exempt from mourning, but if they're transporting a portion of a relative's body, they mourn on that day. The day in which they collect the remains, the bones, they mourn on that day. So therefore we instructed this family, the parents, that it was appropriate for them to mourn on that day. Now a next further question that arose was if when they just would have these small body parts that were identified through DNA identification, what was the mode of burial that was appropriate for these body parts? Normally a person dies, so there's a whole purification process. But here you're dealing with people who fell to their deaths, where there was that one case of the person whose pants were found with body parts inside of the pants. Do you take the body parts out? What exactly do you do? So here too, with dealing with burial laws, there are very specific halachos. That's source test. In Matsu Yisrael Harog, if you find the Jewish person who was killed, so Yikvaru Kamosh Matsu. So then, below Tachlichin, there are no shrouds or anything. You just bury the person according to the way that you found the person, because you don't want to remove any part of the body or the flesh in the process of the purification process. So too, this is appropriate for the Misha Nafal V'Meis, somebody who falls. They fall from a very, very high distance to their death. So we certainly had that type of situation with the 9/11 victims as well. It could be presumed that some of them were incinerated or partially incinerated, but many of them fell to their deaths. Therefore, in this case as well, when there was an identification made, it was appropriate to just bury the bone or bury the pants with the body tissue in it exactly in the form in which it was found. Now, let's say though that they would identify one part of the one body part today, and 2 months later they would identify another body part. That happened with some of the 9/11 victims. In fact, some of the body parts that are now being stored in the 9/11 Museum, which God willing we'll speak about next week, come from victims where there were previous parts of the body that were identified and released to family members, and then when more body parts were identified, the family members had said to the New York City medical examiner's office, if you find any more body parts, we don't want to know. In other words, they already went through their closure, and they didn't want to have to relive that over and over and over again. But in the event that a number of families, whenever a new body part was identified, so they would take it. But you wouldn't want the body parts to be in so many different places. So I quote here from one of the famous works about the laws of mourning by the Gesher HaChaim of Yechiel Michal Tukshinsky. He lived in Israel, or at least a substantial portion of his life in Israel. He lived from 1872 to 1955, so he just mentions the custom. You know, some of these things are based upon custom more than black letter law, but he says the custom is to bury body parts together with or next to the rest of the body. That all things being equal, it's better not to have different body parts buried in different graves or different sections, but to put them all together. So we spoke, you go to source Yud Aleph, this is also an excerpt. I was reading through, actually, the logs and the descriptions of the cases. This is something that we never published because it's too sensitive and it's too personal. A lot of the data that we collected with respect to individual cases, we don't want to put it out there. There were individual widows, for example, who would reach out to me at the Beit and ask me to just read to them orally the entirety of the file that we compiled, and I would do so. But for the most part, I just have them in my own files, and they're very, very fascinating discussions of the research that was done, of the very extensive research that was done by the Beit. And we once met with a couple of the investigative reporters from the newspaper USA Today. Remember, one of them was named Dennis Kochun, and there was one other person. And one of my colleagues, Rabbi Rabbi, and I had a meeting in which we met with them. It was in the Federal Reserve Building. I still remember. We met with them at the Federal Reserve Building near Ground Zero, just to compare notes of our research, because they had done very extensive and assiduous research, and we had done extensive research, and we wanted to benefit from whatever they had done. And they looked at the research that we had done. They said, "Wow, you guys did like a much better job than we did," because we had to be really, really thorough for purposes of Jewish law. So what I did was I contacted Rabbi Yochanan Zon, who's considered to be a premier authority when it comes to matters of Cheva Kadisha, of Jewish burial societies and Jewish burial practices, and I asked him to provide guidance to us to guide and advise the families when it came to the burial of body parts. So this is just, I'll read you from this excerpt. Mr. L's, I'm not giving his full name just for the sake of privacy, Mr. L's remains were sent to Garlic Funeral Home. I'm not giving them the same sense of privacy, maybe I should, but for the individuals involved, I feel there's just more of a need for a sense of privacy. For the public officials, not so much. That's okay. According to Mr. X, him I didn't mention, okay, from Garlic Funeral Home, conversation with Rabbi Reiss, November 8, 2001, the funeral home received a brown bag with the soiled clothing. This was the case of the person whose pants were found with the body parts inside, and a red bag with approximately 2 pounds of skin and bone fragments. Rabbi Yochanan Zon, conversation with me on the same day, a recognized expert on burial issues, stated that the body parts should be buried in a small box without any purification process or shrouds in accordance with the din of Harug, just like a corpse of somebody who had been murdered, in shallow ground in order to enable any other body parts that are discovered to be buried nearby. So he said two very interesting things as a matter of Jewish law. One, that there's no purification process. It should just be buried as it was. And number two, it should be buried in a small box in shallow ground. And that was precisely to fulfill this other custom of the Gesher HaChaim, that if additional body parts would be found, they could more easily be placed in the same box. And Rabbi Zon, then just the rest is just the logistics, showing how much coordination there was between all of the parties and how much meticulous detail we had to be involved in with each and every one of these cases. So that's in terms of abeilus issues, mourning issues, and burial issues. Also something that we couldn't have contemplated. A lot of these things, we were so fixated on just learning and mastering the laws of aguna resolution. To the degree that we could, in order to do our jobs responsibly, but we discovered that there was really a very strong pastoral process that was taking place here in terms of just advising the families with respect to a whole host of different matters, and that involved other types of halakhic queries and questions also that they brought to our attention and that their rabbis brought to our attention, and certainly this was a major part of it, just the mourning and burial process, burial when relevant, and mourning process as well. Now, the next subject matter that I'd like to cover is other barriers to remarriage. We'll do this in the next 15 minutes, and then the third category we'll do next week. So the other barriers to remarriage, there were really three that we came across, meaning that it wasn't the end of our inquiry or the end of our work when we were able to determine, according to halakhic standards, that we had enough evidence to be able to declare the husband as definitively dead, unfortunately, and for the wife to be permitted to remarry. There were three other issues that came up. One is that in 4 of the cases that we dealt with, one of them I mentioned a little earlier today, the wives gave birth to the couple's only child. Really, it was incredible. The couple's only child, either in the weeks or months following 9/11 or in the weeks immediately preceding 9/11. I remember one case where the couple's only child was born a week before the 9/11 tragedy. If you can imagine such a thing. The child had just been born. I don't even know if the bris had happened yet, but that I don't, it was really just almost simultaneous. So there's a halakha, this is source Yud Beis, this is based on a Gemara in Yevamos, that says that a woman can't get remarried anyway if she is either pregnant or she's nursing. If she has a child who's within the first couple of years of life, the woman is not supposed to get remarried. Why is she not supposed to get remarried? So the Gemara has some reasons that might be a little bit difficult to fathom. It suggests that maybe the reason if a pregnant woman, she's pregnant with another man's child and then she got divorced or widowed while she was pregnant, she shouldn't get married while she's still pregnant, in part because of the fact that maybe the new husband won't be so sensitive in terms of how he's going to interact with her body, and therefore he'll crush the fetus. So the Gemara says, well, then her own husband could also crush the fetus. So the Gemara says, no, because her own husband will have compassion because it's his fetus, so he's not going to want to kill a living being. So the Gemara actually ends up saying, well, the new husband also isn't going to want to commit feticide. He's not going to want to actually actively kill the child. Though the Rambam, when he codifies this halakha, says we are still worried about that, interestingly enough. But rather, what is the concern? The concern is that the woman is going to become pregnant again, and this is the same concern for a woman who already gave birth, who's nursing, and that is when she becomes pregnant, the milk supply is going to run out, and then there's not going to be enough nutrition for her baby. So if the baby belongs to the man she's married to, he's the father, he'll make sure that he takes care of the nutritional needs of the child. But if it's not the father, even though he might not want to actively kill the child, but he's not going to go out of his way to take extra special care of the child, and therefore the child's life will be more in jeopardy. And it's interesting that, even in cases where one can make the argument, we don't have to worry with this guy, and maybe we should make an exception. Rabbinic authorities were always very, very strict about this because they said, look, this is in the Gemara, our sages knew what was best, and they made this decree, and it's not our place to subvert or circumvent this decree. Now, so that's a source Yud Gimel, is the quote from the Shulchan Aruch. Our rabbis, I'll read you the English part. Our rabbis decree that a man may not marry a woman who is pregnant or nursing a previous husband's child until the baby is 24 months old, even if she decides to wean the child during that period. Because she might say, well, I'm going to wean the child anyway, so what difference is it going to make if I become pregnant again? It's not going to cut off the baby's supply because the baby is weaned anyway. But we don't want to encourage her to wean the child just in order to get remarried, because it's felt that the rabbis felt it was very, very important. I think many to this day still feel that way, for the child's nutritional needs to ideally be nursed by the mother. Now, if it's a mother who, for whatever reason, doesn't have the wherewithal or ability to nurse altogether, then the rabbis say this law would not apply. But if it is somebody who has the capacity to nurse a child, so then this was a very strict law. Other rabbinic authorities have tried to whittle it down. There's a statement of one of the later authorities, of Shlomo Kluger, that nowadays no woman, I don't know what his days were, I guess also the 19th century, he says nowadays, in his days, nobody nurses a child past 18 months. 18 months, everybody's finished. I don't think it's true anymore. I don't know, plenty of women who nurse their babies after 18 months. But he says nowadays nobody nurses after 18 months, so therefore nowadays we can be lenient after 18 months. And Moshe Feinstein has a response to him about this as well, the late 20th century, that maybe there's room for leniency. And they speak about maybe there's room for leniency if the mother is going out of her mind, and if she's not able to get remarried, then she's just going to go berserk because she has she has this small baby, and she's young and she wants to move on with her life. And if we're not going to find leniency for her, it's going to really be detrimental to her mental and emotional state. So they talk about how in extreme circumstances there might be room for leniency as well. But by and large, it's really very much a case-by-case determination, and we needed for the women whom we were permitting to remarry, since in 4 of the cases this was a relevant determination, we need to flag the issue. So if you look at the way in which we flag the issue, this is source Yud Daled, in the middle of page 4, we wrote letters to each of the women when we permitted them to remarry. So we wrote official letters. It was signed by the 4 members of the rabbinic staff of the Beit of America, including Rabbi Gedaliah Dov Schwartz here in Chicago, including Rabbi Willig, including Rabbi Boyd, including myself. Those were the 4 signatories on every single letter. And for those women for whom it was applicable, this was the language that we used. So there's a sample letter that was sent March 11, 2002. I don't think we were thinking at the time that this is, what would March have been? It would have been, I guess, 5 months, right? It was 6 months. It was 6 months, exactly 6 months, exactly half a year after 9/11. We didn't like sit there and think to ourselves, oh, we're sending this out exactly half a year after 9/11. But it's interesting. It was exactly half a year after 9/11. You should be aware that there are certain Jewish law guidelines regarding how much time must lapse before the mother of an infant child is permitted to remarry. It is therefore possible that you will need to obtain special permission to remarry if 24 Hebrew calendar months have not yet elapsed from the birth of your child. If necessary, you can consult with either the Beit of America or with your local rabbi with respect to this issue. So really what we were doing was just flagging the issue. We weren't telling them it's going to absolutely be prohibited across the board, but we want them to be aware of the issue so that it wouldn't, hit them by surprise. Now, L'maisa, in actuality, none of the women were, ready to jump back and, get married within 2 years after after 9/11. But I think that after 2 years expired, within like the 3rd or 4th year, a couple of them actually did get, remarried at that point in time, which was good because the whole point was to enable them to be able to remarry and move on with their lives. The one from Riverdale had a child. I said that she was pregnant and she had a child. And that child, actually, since we were living in Riverdale at the time, became good friends with one of my sons, and they actually, grew up together for a few years until she got remarried and moved out of the community. Now, the other issue was that in certain cases, in 2 of the cases, as I mentioned, there were 4 cases where the couple's only child was born right around 9/11, either before or afterwards. But there were 2 cases where a couple did not have any natural children together. Meaning that one case, the husband and wife had only been married for maybe a year and they hadn't started having children yet. In another case, they actually had been married for a while and they had a child, but it was an adopted child. People didn't know it was an adopted child, but it wasn't a natural child. The husband never actually had any natural children. So here, the Torah tells us, this is from Deuteronomy, it's from Devarim, I gave you all the psukim, it's the Parsha of Yibum. It's a ritual that you read about, but it doesn't happen so often in real life, where the Torah tells you that if a man has a brother and he gets married and he doesn't have any children, so his wife then is designated to marry his brother. His brother is supposed to step into his shoes and take over the building of his home to marry his widow. That's called Yibum. And in the event that they don't want to marry each other, he doesn't want to marry her, or she doesn't want to marry him, so then the only way that she's permitted to marry anybody else, she can't just go and marry somebody else because she's linked or designated to marry the brother. She has to go through a process of Chalitza, which is a ritual whereby the sister-in-law, the widow, has to take off a shoe from the brother-in-law and to symbolize the fact that he's not stepping into his brother's shoes. And throw the shoe away, and she has to expectorate in his presence. Not the most, pleasant thing per se. And there's a recitation of various verses that she says and he says. She has to say, "Oh, my brother-in-law is me'enya me. He's refusing to do yibum on me," and he has to say, "Lo chapasti lechachta." He has to say, "I don't want to marry her." and they have to go through this ritual. And there's a very special shoe. It's not just any shoe. You can't just buy a shoe and the Forshaim or whatever, go and buy any kind of shoe. You have to buy. It has to be a specifically designed shoe from the hide of a kosher animal, and it has to be hard leather, and it has to go up a certain amount above the ankle, but not till the knee, and very specific specifications as to how the shoe is supposed to be made. And only a bezdin has to precise. It's Vikari Shmon b'Yisrael. She has to go up to the elders. It has to be presided over by a betin. So in those two cases, we actually had to perform a Chalitza ceremony. Let's say that they would have wanted to do Yibum, they wouldn't have wanted to do Yibum, but that's source 16, which points out that at least in the Ashkenazi communities, we don't allow people to do Yibum nowadays because normally there's a prohibition against marrying one's brother's wife. That's one of the serious prohibited arayos, incestuous relationships that are prohibited by penalty of death, at least divine death, according to the Torah. And in order for that to be bypassed, the brother-in-law in this case would have to be prepared to marry the sister-in-law only for the sake of mitzvah. It has to be that he's doing it for the sake of fulfilling this mitzvah. So there was a fear. Maybe he'll want to do it because he likes her. He finds her attractive, and not for the sake of mitzvah. And there were authorities who said, well, then that doesn't work. Then that's considered to be a violation of the incestuous relationship. It has to only be for the mitzvah. So therefore, in order to avoid those types of problems, we don't even allow Yibum. In the Ashkenazi community, in the Sephardic community, it's sometimes allowed. In the Ashkenazi community, we don't allow Yibum. So it had to be Chalitza. So what was very, very interesting is that we had to, first of all, spell this out. So that's source 17. So we wrote in the letter to those two women, we wrote the following language: because your husband died without children, and he has a brother, there is a Jewish law requirement that the brother perform the ritual known as Chalitza in order for you to be permitted to remarry under Jewish law. The Beit of America is prepared to coordinate and supervise the Chalitza ceremony in a discreet and dignified manner. Now, one thing that's an interesting side point of the Chalitza ceremony is that while normally a woman who's a widow, as opposed to a woman who's divorced, a woman who's a widow is allowed to marry a Kohen. A Kohen is restricted from marrying various women, including a divorced woman, but a widow he can marry, but not if the widow is a Chalutza, not if she has to go to a Chalitza. So we added the sentence saying, following the Chalitza ceremony, you will be permitted to remarry anyone other than a Kohen according to Jewish law. So it was interesting that one of the cases, the man who had died, he had a brother. The brother was only around 16 years old. Now, if the brother would have been 8 years old, that would have been a real problem because we would have had to wait 5 years before the woman could even go through the ceremony, and then she would have been stuck for 5 years. Or imagine if he would have had like a 1-year-old baby brother, that would have really, been problematic. But fortunately, he was old enough to do Chalitza. He was 16, but you can imagine how traumatic this was for him. He had just lost his brother, who was maybe 22 years old. And then now he has to appear in front of a betin. There has to be at least 10 men in the room, and he has to have this woman spitting in his presence, and he has to, put on the shoe that's going to be removed from his foot, and it's a little bit of an overwhelming and traumatic ceremony, but it was, certainly an emotionally fragile moment, but he went through with it, and, it was something that we were proud that, he stepped up to, as it were, to the moment. And then 9 years later, I remember this was right before the 10th year anniversary. This was in the year 2010. I was in Riverdale. I was still living in Riverdale. We lived there until we moved to Chicago. And I was invited to a Sheva Brachos for a family that I knew of that had just married off their daughter. And I was invited because I'm a rabbinic figure. They needed somebody to give a speech. And also I lived across the street, and they needed a minyan, so all the usual reasons you get invited to a Sheva Brachos. And I showed up there, and I knew the wife's family, and I wished the Mazel Tov Zakal, and I was serving as dean at the Yeshiva University at the time. And the boy, who's the chassid, he walks in and he says, "Oh, do you know who I am?" So I felt very bad. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't remember. What year are you in?" I figured he's a student of mine, from yeshiva. He says, "No, I don't go to yeshiva, but we met 9 years ago because I was at the Beit of America and I was there to do Chalitza for my sister-in-law, And that was that fellow who was the teenager at the time. And there I was, speaking at a Sheva Brachos. So I got up and I said, I can tell you from personal experience that I know that this chassan is a fellow of sterling character. Who really, steps up to the plate, in difficult situations. And I'm not going to tell you how I know that. So that was, a heartwarming, moment just to see the people being able to move on, afterwards in positive ways. So the last thing, and I'll just conclude with this, is that there was one case where the woman in question had gone through, this was her fourth marriage. She had been divorced from her first husband, widowed from her second husband, divorced from her third husband, and then widowed from this fellow who died in the 9/11 attacks. So it turns out that she had been widowed twice. She had two husbands who died. And that brings up another halacha that's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. It comes from the Gemara. Not a well-known halacha necessarily, doesn't come up that much. That source, Yud Ches, is called katlanis. Shulchan Aruch, I'll read the English translation. If a woman was married to two men and they both died, she should not marry a third man because she has already established a pattern of dying husbands. So we had to also reckon with this as well. So all kinds of things that came up. However, at least we had the Ramah to rely upon. The Ramah is Rav Moshe Isserlis, who lived around the same time as the Shulchan Aruch, and wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch for the Ashkenazi community. But so the Ramah adds that Yeshom and Dadavke Mesu Misas Asmam. But he says that this is only if they die naturally, but not if the husband was killed or died in a plague or fell to his death. So this was certainly a combination of being killed and falling to their deaths. So therefore we could rely upon the Ramah. There were other grounds also to rely upon this as well. One is that the Beit Shmuel says that this isn't, quotes the Rambam, as saying that this prohibition is not like a real prohibition per se. It's just more kind of that for people who might not have, the greatest of luck anyway, so it's not necessarily advisable to go into a marriage that, already has bad luck, written all over it. And also there are other authorities, like quoted of Yechiel Michal Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, who gives other grounds for leniency as well, that if the husbands didn't die right away, in this particular case she had been married to this husband who was killed in 9/11, from 1996, so they had already been married for 5 years, so it's not right away. So then you also don't necessarily attribute it to her. And also if there was another husband in between the two husbands who died that she got divorced from, so that's not like in a row. So then there's room for leniency, and in fact that's what had happened in this case. So we framed that resolution, and I just give you the excerpt here in a source, Chaf Aleph, source 22, from the Tshuva, the responsive that was written by our own Rabbi Gedalia Dov Schwartz, permitting the various women to be married. So he explains, quoting his various sources that I just mentioned, why we don't have to worry about katlanis, why we don't have to worry about the fact that this woman had two husbands who died. So all of these other ancillary issues really came into play, and it really required us to focus on so many different aspects of Jewish law in the course of the 9/11 Aguna resolutions. Now next time, Mi'as Hashem, I'll go into the third topic that I had set aside in these source sheets, which is the question of, it wasn't a question that would have been asked to us at the time by the Pentagon or by the President of the United States, but the question that was contemplated, if they would have had the ability to shoot down the planes as the planes were about to hit the the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, would that have been a proper thing to do? How do we approach that question according to Jewish law, to shoot down a plane carrying innocent civilians in order to prevent more people from getting killed, especially if they're likely going to die anyway? And we'll also speak about some of the Tumas Kohanim issues when it comes to Ground Zero and whether Kohanim can go into the 9/11 museum, given all of the body parts that are stored there and that are stored or located in the area. So God willing, we'll speak about that next time.
Next week we're not meeting on Wednesday, we're meeting on Monday, I believe.
Oh, we are?
That's...
Oh, okay, thank you for reminding me. I don't think I necessarily knew that.
Next week?
Because it's Thanksgiving week.
We're skipping a week. I mean, yes, we skip a week, and our final Shiva is Monday the 28th.
Okay, so next time.
Next time, Monday the 28th.
Not on there of Thanksgiving.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much.
Okay.
Anything around for Marvin? We'll do that? Great.